code. The necessity at first is to declare connection and a record set variable for your database in Microsoft Access. And then I called this function analyze increments and connected it to my button, and these variables will come into play later. So the first part is establishing the connection with the database and then importing the increments of 0%, 2%, and so on and so forth into the table into Excel, and that's where the myCell variable comes into play and the row count, so we can offset myCell in the table in order to populate it with the field increment in the database, and then we want to close that connection. Then I'm going to initialize another count variable that corresponds to the location of the rows in the table, and a display count to help offset my cell again for the populating of the table with our solver solution. And then I open up another connection so I can manipulate the database and update it. And this, starting for each row in the Excel file, we are setting our objective values and our decision variables to their location in Excel, corresponding to the functions that are placed in them, or just values to be manipulated for our solver function, which we recorded in macro and then modified it a little bit to give us the best output. And then after that, we are selecting our increment count, which is 8, and on row J basically, and we are setting that active cell value, and we're going to multiply that active cell value by 20,000, which is our original capacity, and add it to 20,000 to show our increment in door capacity. As we loop through and get our solutions for this display count, which is 0, we're going to populate that table by offsetting and then setting number of thrill seekers, number of cruisers, and our profits in that table to populate it or fill out the table. And then we're going to update those values into the database, which is why I opened the connection earlier. This function basically finds this in the database, the increment ID field, which is the primary key, and I set it equal to the display count, because there is a primary key from 1 to 6 in the table, and once it finds that record, you can update those values by setting the field equal to our number of thrill seekers, number of cruisers, and our profits, and then you end that whole statement with rs update, and it updates that record in the table in the database. And then we're going to loop around and do that for each scenario, as I just showed you. And then we want to close that connection, and then we want to build our chart. And to do that, I recorded a macro, and I'm going to show you those under here briefly. You can look at them. This subsolve A is the solver for part A, which I'll show you in a second. Subsolve B is for this solver for part 2. And then this is the building of the chart. I use that as a function, and then these are to label the axes. And that's the title of the chart. We're going to solve A, which was just for one scenario with the constraint of door capacity at 20,000, and our specified problem, which I just mentioned probably in the slide before this, are given right here. We have our constraints. They need to be less than this, door capacity, and so on and so forth. There's our objective function. We're going to manipulate these two cells. We connected solve A to this, and it's going to give us our optimal solution for this one scenario. This is the database that I used, and we're going to update this and fill out the table in Excel now. As you can see, it's a similar setup, but we're going to populate the increments like I told you before, and if you can follow the code that I just mentioned, you will see it come to life now. And there you have it. We have populated each optimal scenario for each increment in the constraint of door supply or door capacity, and we have shown that relationship with this chart. Therefore, as capacity increases, so do profits, and so does the production of the thrill seekers, but the cruisers decrease in volume. And if this worked, we will go into Access, and we will see that it has also updated our data table in Access. And that shows the successful implementation of Project 1.